The ivory harvest. The dream was always the same. It began not with a jolt, but with a slow, creeping awareness. A subtle loosening. It started with an incisor, the one just to the right of the center. In the strange, murky logic of the dreamscape, I would be talking to someone I could not see, their voice a low hum just outside my perception. As I formed words, I would feel the tooth shift in its socket, a tiny, sickening pivot against the gum. Panic, cold and immediate, would flood my dream self. I would stop talking, pressing my tongue against the tooth, trying to hold it in place. But the pressure of my own tongue would be its undoing. The root would give way with a soft, internal pop, and the tooth would be free in my mouth, a slick, alien object. Then the contagion would spread. The one next to it would begin to wobble. Then a canine. Then the molars, great and solid anchors of my jaw, would start to rock like loose stones in dry soil. The dream never had sound beyond that low hum and the wet, clicking noises of enamel and dentin parting from flesh. The horror was tactile. I could feel them, a mouthful of them, like a collection of unwanted pebbles. I would try to spit them out, but my jaw would be locked, and I would be forced to swallow them, one by one, feeling them scrape down my throat. I always woke up just before the last one fell, my own gasp for air dragging me back to the waking world. My heart would be a frantic drum against my ribs. I would lie in the dark, my tongue darting around my mouth in a desperate, frantic inventory. Solid. All solid. Every tooth was present, accounted for, and firmly rooted. The relief was a physical thing, a cool wave washing over the phantom heat of the dream's panic. For months, this was the routine. The unsettling dream, the frantic awakening, the wave of relief. It was, I told myself, just stress. A classic anxiety dream. Nothing more. This morning was different. The dream had been particularly vivid. A full set. I had felt every single one detach, a cascade of failure in my own mouth, until I was left with nothing but soft, useless gums. The finality of it was what woke me, a sense of total, irreversible loss. I sat up in bed, the gray pre-dawn light filtering through my blinds. My hand flew to my mouth, my fingers tracing the line of my teeth through my cheek. Solid. All there. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the familiar relief starting to settle my racing pulse. Just a dream. A bad one, but just a dream. I swung my legs out of bed and rubbed the sleep from my eyes. My neck was stiff. I must have slept in a strange position, coiled in a ball of dream-induced tension. I reached back to fluff my pillow, to punch it back into a shape that didn't look like it had been in a fight. My fingers brushed against something small, hard, and smooth on the sheet, just where my head had been. I recoiled at first. A bug? A piece of plastic? I squinted in the dim light. It was white. Bone white. With a slow, dawning horror that felt far colder and sharper than anything the dream had produced, I picked it up. It was a tooth. It was unmistakably a human tooth. A premolar, to be exact. It was perfect, with a short, slightly curved root and a clean, undamaged crown. There was no blood, no shred of tissue clinging to it. It was as clean and sterile as a specimen in a museum. I held it in the palm of my hand, my own breath caught in my throat. It felt heavy. Important. Impossible. My first rational thought was a desperate lunge for an explanation. It had to be one of my old baby teeth. Maybe it had fallen into a crack in the floorboards years ago and somehow, through a series of improbable events involving laundry and static cling, ended up in my bed. It was a flimsy, ridiculous theory, but my mind clung to it like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. I stood up and walked to the bathroom, the tooth clutched in my fist. I leaned over the sink, flicked on the light, and opened my mouth. I used my finger to probe, to count, to check. Every single adult tooth I owned was exactly where it was supposed to be. There were no gaps. No fresh wounds. No sign of anything having been recently vacated. My jaw was whole. So where did this come from? I uncurled my fingers and stared at the tooth in my palm. The porcelain of the sink was white, the fluorescent light was white, and the tooth was a purer, more organic white than either. It was a piece of a person, and I had found it under my pillow after a dream about losing it. The relief I had felt just moments before was gone, replaced by a creeping dread that had nothing to do with sleep. This was real. This was in my hand. The dream had, somehow, followed me out. The tooth sat in a small, zip-top bag on my kitchen counter, a silent, mocking testament to my fracturing sanity. For 2 days I tried to ignore it. I moved it into a drawer, but that felt worse, like hiding a secret. I put it back on the counter, where I could see it, as if keeping it in my line of sight would prevent it from doing whatever it was that I was afraid of. My life continued, but only on the surface. At work, I stared at spreadsheets, the numbers blurring into patterns that looked like jawbones. I drank my coffee and felt the warmth on my teeth, newly and terribly aware of their presence, their fragility. The dreams did not stop. If anything, they grew more confident. The slow, creeping looseness was replaced by a more aggressive extraction. In the dream world, a subtle pressure would build behind my teeth, as if from the inside, pushing them outward. They would pop free with the soundless force of a cork from a bottle, one after the other, a relentless, percussive loss. Each night, I woke with a silent scream lodged in my throat. And each morning, I would perform the same terrifying ritual. I would hold my breath and slide my hand under my pillow. On the third morning, my fingers found another one. This time, it was a canine. Longer, sharper, its root elegantly tapered. It was just as clean and perfect as the first. Now there were 2 of them in the little plastic bag. A collection. The thought sent a tremor through me. This was not a fluke. This was a pattern. A process. My flimsy theory about a lost baby tooth was now utterly laughable. This was happening. To me. Right now. The line between my sleeping mind and the waking world was not just blurring. It was being actively breached. Something was crossing over. And it was leaving these little bone trophies behind as proof of its passage. I knew I needed help, but what kind? A therapist would tell me it was a manifestation of stress and would likely suggest I get rid of the prop that was reinforcing the delusion. A police officer would look at me like I was a lunatic. My mind, clinging to the last vestiges of rational thought, settled on the only person who dealt in the currency of teeth. A dentist. Dr. Anya Sharma was a woman who radiated competence. Her office was bright, sterile, and smelled of mint and latex, a scent I usually found reassuring. Today, it felt like the set of a play, a backdrop of normalcy against which my bizarre drama would unfold. I sat in the reclining chair, the paper bib clipped around my neck, and tried to sound calm. "So, what seems to be the trouble, Alex?" she asked, her smile kind as she reviewed my chart. "Just a checkup today?" "Something like that," I mumbled, my mouth dry. "I've been having a strange issue," I tried to explain. I left out the dreams. I knew how it would sound. I focused on the physical evidence. "I've been finding teeth," I said, the words feeling heavy and absurd on my tongue. "In my bed. When I wake up." Dr. Sharma's kind smile faltered, replaced by a look of professional concern. "You've been losing teeth in your sleep? We need to take a look at that right away. It could be a sign of advanced bruxism or a periodontal issue." No, that's the thing, I said, my voice rising with a frantic edge. They aren't my teeth. I mean, my teeth are all still here. I'm finding extra ones. I watched her process this. The slight furrow of her brow, the way her eyes darted from my face to my chart and back again. She was searching for a logical framework for my statement, and finding none. Extra teeth, she repeated slowly. Yes. She recovered quickly, her professional mask sliding back into place. All right, Alex. Let's just have a look, and we'll take a full set of X-rays. We'll get to the bottom of this. For the next hour, I endured the familiar routine of scrapes, pokes, and whirring machines. She was thorough, her movements precise and efficient. She took the X-rays, the bitter taste of the cardboard film holder flooding my mouth. I sat and waited while the images processed, my leg bouncing with an energy I couldn't contain. She came back into the room and clipped the film onto the lightbox, her face unreadable. She stared at the ghostly images of my jaw, at the pale shapes of roots embedded in bone. She looked for a long, silent moment. Well, Alex, she said, finally turning to face me. I have to say, your teeth are in excellent health. Gums are fine, no signs of decay, no inflammation. And the X-rays confirm it. You have a perfect, complete set of 32 teeth, all exactly where they should be. There are no gaps, no impacted wisdom teeth, nothing that would account for extras. The sterile, minty air of the office suddenly felt suffocating. The scientific, rational world had given me its verdict. I was fine. There was nothing wrong. This was the worst possible news. It meant that the explanation was not medical, not dental, not anything that could be fixed with a tool or a procedure. It was something else. Something other. I left her office with a receipt for a clean bill of health and a fear that was colder and deeper than ever. My problem wasn't real in a way she could measure, but it was real enough to leave evidence. Back in my apartment, I logged onto my computer, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed my absurd predicament into the search bar. Finding teeth under pillow. I scrolled past forums on dream interpretation and anxiety blogs, and then I saw it. A single, obscure link to a digitized folklore journal from decades ago. A snippet of a story about a creature of nightmare and shadow, a being that visited sleepers in the grip of great anxiety. The article called it a harvester. An ivory harvester. The term, ivory harvester, clung to my thoughts like a burr. It gave a name to the faceless dread that was dismantling my life, and that was somehow worse. A monster with a name is a monster with a purpose. A harvest implies a harvester, a conscious entity performing a deliberate act. It wasn't just a freak occurrence. I was afield, and something was reaping me. Sleep became the enemy. I dreaded the approach of night, the way the shadows in my apartment would lengthen and deepen. My bedroom, once a sanctuary, now felt like a baited trap. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room, leaving every light on, the television murmuring on a low volume. I reasoned that it was a less intimate space, more open. A harder place for things to hide. I was bargaining with a phantom. For a few nights, it seemed to work. My sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by the flickering of the television and the hum of the refrigerator, but the terrible dreams of dental ruin stayed away. I would wake up groggy and unrest, my back aching from the couch cushions, but when I ran my hand over the scratchy fabric beneath my head, I found nothing. A fragile, temporary hope began to sprout in the barren ground of my fear. Maybe I had broken the cycle. Maybe all it took was a change of venue and 100 watts of electricity. The hope lasted for 3 nights. On the 4th night, exhaustion won. It was a deep, dragging weariness that pulled me down faster than I could fight it. I remember sinking into the couch, the drone of a late-night talk show host, a distant lullaby. I didn't even have a dream. Just a fall into a black, dreamless void. It was a mercy, I thought, until I woke up. It wasn't a slow awakening. It was a sudden, violent snap back to consciousness, the kind that leaves you breathless and disoriented. The air in the room was cold. Colder than it should have been. The television was off, its screen a black, reflective mirror. I hadn't turned it off. I never turned it off. A profound silence had fallen over the apartment, the familiar hum of the refrigerator conspicuously absent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a presence in itself. And there was a smell. Faint, but distinct. It was the smell of dry clay and chalk dust, an earthy, ancient scent that had no place in my clean apartment. My heart hammered against my ribs. I did not want to move. I did not want to look. I wanted to stay perfectly still and pretend I was still asleep, but I knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that I was not alone. My gaze flickered to the far corner of the room, near the doorway to the hall. In the deep shadows, where the light from the street lamp outside couldn't quite reach, something was wrong. The darkness there was thicker, more substantial. It seemed to coalesce, to gather itself into a shape. It was tall, impossibly so, its form thin and stretched, like a shadow that had been pulled taut. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes, just a shifting column of deeper black against the blackness. I couldn't breathe. My lungs were seized with a cold fist of terror. The shape did not move in a conventional way. It didn't step or walk. It simply drifted. It glided across the floor from the corner of the room toward the couch, a silent, fluid motion that defied physics. The chalk dust smell intensified. I could hear a sound now, a faint, dry clicking, like pebbles being gently rolled together in a velvet bag. It was halfway across the room when I finally found my voice, or at least, a pathetic imitation of it. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. The sound, small as it was, broke the spell. The shape froze. And then it unraveled. It didn't run or disappear in a puff of smoke. It simply dissolved, its form fraying at the edges and melting back into the ambient shadows, until the corner of the room was just a corner again. The oppressive silence broke as the refrigerator motor kicked back on with a shuddering hum. I lay there for a long time, shaking, my body slick with a cold sweat. It was real. I had seen it. A harvester. My harvester. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to push myself into a sitting position. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, went to the cushion where my head had been. My fingers closed around a familiar, hard shape. I pulled it out into the faint light. It was a molar. Huge, with 3 distinct roots. And this one, unlike the others, felt warm. As if it had just recently been part of something living. Seeing the thing, the harvester, changed everything. The fear was no longer a creeping, abstract dread. It was a sharp, tangible terror born of a memory. The memory of that silent, gliding form. The smell of chalk. The sound of clicking. My apartment no longer felt like my own. It felt like a compromised territory, a place I had to share with an uninvited guest of the most awful kind. Rationality had completely abandoned me. I was operating on pure, primal instinct. My first action was to buy a camera, a cheap little webcam that I plugged into my laptop. I positioned it on my bookshelf, aimed directly at my bed. I had no intention of sleeping in there, not anymore, but the bed and the pillow seemed to be the focal point of the phenomenon. It was the stage. I wanted to see the actor. I'd barricaded the bedroom door at night, piling books and a chair against it, a flimsy and pathetic defense that did more for my psyche than it could ever do for my physical safety. My nights were spent on the couch, but sleep was a distant country I could no longer visit. I existed in a state of hypervigilant exhaustion, fueled by caffeine and fear. I would doze for minutes at a time, jerking awake at the slightest sound. The dream of losing my teeth returned, but it had changed. It was no longer an internal, passive experience. This time, in the dream, I felt a presence with me. A cold weight pressed on the side of my face, and I felt a long, cool finger gently, almost clinically, push against my jaw. The pressure increased, and in the dream, a tooth gave way. I woke with a gasp, my own hand flying to my mouth. I felt it immediately. The gap. It was smooth, slick, and horribly empty. I scrambled off the couch and stumbled into the bathroom, my reflection a pale, wild-eyed stranger in the mirror. I pulled my lip back. The second premolar on the upper left side. Gone. Not a dream tooth left under my pillow. A real tooth, from my own head, was missing. There was no blood, no pain, just a clean, perfect void where a part of me used to be. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. The barrier had been crossed. It wasn't just harvesting the psychic echoes of my fear anymore. It wasn't just pulling dream objects into reality. It had taken something from my physical body. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised to an unbearable level. What was next? Another? All of them? What happened when it ran out of teeth to take? The question was a black pit in my mind, and I could not bear to look into it. My first thought was the camera. I had to see. I had to know what had happened in that room. With trembling hands, I unbarricaded the bedroom door and retrieved my laptop. I sat on the floor of the living room, my back against the couch, and opened the video file. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage. It was just my empty room, silent and still. The shifting light as the sun went down, the deep shadows of night. Nothing. My heart began to sink. Was I wrong? Did it happen on the couch? Did I imagine it all? Then, at 3:17 a.m. according to the timestamp, the image flickered. The screen dissolved into a brief burst of digital static, a hash of green and gray lines that lasted for maybe 2 seconds. And then the picture returned. But it was not the same. In the center of the room, standing beside the bed, was the harvester. The webcam's cheap lens couldn't capture it clearly. It was a wavering, distorted figure of shadow and glinting white, but it was there. Its form was long and emaciated, its limbs too thin for their length. It moved toward the bed. It did not touch my pillow. Instead, it leaned over the spot where my head would have been, and it reached out a long, pale, three-fingered hand. The hand didn't rest on the pillow. It sank into it, as if the fabric were water. The creature was still for a moment, its hand buried to the wrist in the down and cotton. Then, slowly, it withdrew its hand, and clutched in its spidery fingers was a single, gleaming white tooth. It held the tooth for a moment, almost admiringly. It brought it close to where a face should have been, and then it turned and dissolved back into the static from which it had emerged. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. I understood now. It wasn't taking the teeth from my mouth in my sleep. It was harvesting them from my dreams. It was reaching into my subconscious and pulling the dream teeth, the symbols of my fear, out into the physical world. The ones I found under my pillow were the fruits of its labor. But last night, something had changed. The connection, the breach, had become so strong that when it pulled the tooth from my dream, its real-life counterpart had simply vanished. It had been unmade. Erased. The hole in my smile was a constant, physical reminder. Every time my tongue brushed against the smooth gap, a fresh spike of fear lanced through me. The video on my laptop was the confirmation. I was not sick. I was not crazy. I was being haunted by something that operated on rules I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just a ghost, it was a thief, stealing pieces of me by stealing the pieces of my dreams. I spent the next day in a fever of research, diving deeper into the obscure corners of the internet. The term, ivory harvester, yielded a few more hits, fragments of folklore from different cultures, all describing a similar entity. A shadow creature, a collector of teeth, drawn to anxiety like a moth to a flame. The teeth, according to one particularly strange text, were not for nourishment. They were trophies. They were a physical manifestation of the fear it consumed. The creature fed on the terror, and the teeth were the empty shells left behind. The more I feared it, the more I feared losing my teeth, the more tangible they became in my dreams, and the easier the harvest. I was trapped in a feedback loop from hell. My fear was its food, and the evidence of its feeding only made me more afraid. Running was not an option. It was clear the creature was attached to me, not to my apartment. It had found me on the couch just as easily as it had in the bed. So if I couldn't run from it, and I couldn't hide from it, what was left? One recurring theme in the folklore was the idea of will. The harvester preyed on the passive, the terrified, those who were swept away by their nightmares. It had power in the dream world, where the victim's own mind created the landscape. The thought was terrifying, but it also contained a sliver of hope. If the dream was my space, my creation, then maybe I wasn't entirely powerless there. I couldn't stop being afraid, that was impossible. But maybe I could change the dream. That night, I didn't try to stay awake. I prepared for sleep as if I were preparing for a battle. It felt insane, but it was the only plan I had. I went into my bedroom, the first time I had entered it at night in almost a week. I turned on the lights, all of them. I didn't barricade the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and I didn't think about my teeth being loose. I thought about them being strong. I thought about the roots, picturing them in my mind as long, steel pylons drilled deep into the bone of my jaw. I remembered a time in college when I had won a debate, the feeling of confidence, of my words being solid and unassailable. I held on to that feeling. I lay down, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. The sheets were cool. I closed my eyes, focusing not on the fear, but on the feeling of steel roots. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. I was inviting it in. I was setting my own trap on my own territory. Sleep came, and with it, the dream. The familiar, awful sensation began. The loosening. The incisor first, just like always. But this time, I didn't panic. In the dream, I focused. I pictured the steel root, and I willed it to hold. The loosening stopped. The dream world wavered, as if confused. Then the pressure came again, harder this time, a full frontal assault on my entire jaw. I felt them all begin to shake, to rattle, but I held on to the image of steel and stone, of immovable strength. And then I saw it. Not as a shadow in the corner of a room, but here, in my dream. It stood before me, vast and terrible. It was woven from shadow and dust, its body a gaunt frame of something that looked like pale, dry bone. 2 points of faint, cold light burned where its eyes should be. The clicking sound was loud here, the sound of 1,000 teeth rattling in a dry sack. It raised a long, skeletal hand, and the smell of chalk and graves filled my dream senses. It was angry. I could feel its frustration, its rage, pouring off it in waves of cold. The harvest was being denied. It lunged for me, its long fingers reaching for my mouth. But instead of cowering, I lunged back. I don't know what I did. I screamed, I pushed, I fought with the desperate, abstract fury that only dreams allow. It was a battle of will, my focused intent against its hungry presence. I woke up with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in my bed. Sunlight was streaming through the window. It was morning. My body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, as if I had run a marathon in my sleep. My jaw throbbed with a dull, residual ache. I sat there, breathing heavily, the silence of the room a welcome relief. Tentatively, I reached a hand up and slid it under my pillow. Nothing. Just the soft cotton of the pillowcase. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for my entire life. I scrambled out of bed and went to the bathroom, flipping on the light. I leaned over the sink, my heart pounding, and opened my mouth. The gap was still there. A permanent, dark little window in my smile. A scar. I don't know if I won. I don't know if it's gone forever, or if it's just waiting, letting its field lie fallow until a new crop of fear is ready to be reaped. Some nights, I still feel a phantom looseness in my teeth, a faint echo of the old nightmare. But it hasn't come back. The collection in the little plastic bag remains at 3. I keep them in my desk drawer, a reminder of what happens when a dream decides to wake up. And every morning, I look at my reflection, at the hole in my smile, and I understand that I survived, but I did not escape unchanged. I was harvested. The weeping in the walls. The first time I heard it, I blamed the pipes. It was the only logical explanation. My apartment, number 4B, was in a pre-war building, a lovely old dinosaur of a place with intricate crown molding and floors that sighed under every footstep. Buildings like this came with their own symphony of sounds, the hiss of the radiators in winter, the groan of the elevator in the shaft, the low rumble of plumbing snaking through the walls. I was an architect. I appreciated the bones of a place, its history, its character. The noises were part of the charm. So when a faint, high-pitched wail threaded its way through the quiet of my first Tuesday night, I simply turned a page in my book and attributed it to water pressure in an ancient copper pipe. But it happened again the next night. And the night after that. It was always late, long after the city's traffic had dwindled to a distant hum, and the apartments around me had fallen silent. The sound was thin, almost ethereal. It was the sound of a very young baby, crying with that desperate, helpless intensity that seems to tear at something primal in your chest. My first rational thought, after dismissing the plumbing, was a new neighbor. Perhaps the couple in 5B, directly above me, had a newborn. Or maybe it was the family in 4A, across the hall. The walls were thick plaster, but sound could travel in strange ways through vents and floorboards. I felt a pang of sympathy for the tired parents, and a small measure of relief that it was not my responsibility. By the second week, the sound had become a familiar, if unsettling, part of my nightly routine. I would finish my work, make a cup of tea, settle into my armchair, and wait. It would start as a soft whimper, so quiet I'd wonder if I was imagining it. Then it would swell into a full, heartbreaking cry. It wasn't a colicky, angry scream. It was a sound of profound loneliness, of a need that was not being met. I started trying to pinpoint its location. I'd stand in the center of my living room, turning my head slowly, like a human radar dish. It never seemed to come from the ceiling or the adjoining wall with 4A. It felt closer. It felt like it was coming from inside my own apartment. This was, of course, impossible. I lived alone. I had lived alone for 7 years. I was a man of routine and order. My space was meticulously organized, a reflection of my own mind. There were no hidden corners, no secret occupants. And yet, the crying persisted, a needle of impossible sound stitching itself into the fabric of my quiet life. One evening, driven by a growing unease that was beginning to curdle into something colder, I decided to investigate properly. The crying had just begun, a pathetic mewling that seemed to be emanating from the main wall of the living room, the one that backed onto the building's old, disused service shaft. I pressed my ear against the cool plaster. The sound was instantly clearer, louder. It was undeniably on my side of the wall. The vibrations were faint, but I could feel them against my cheek. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. There was no baby in the wall. That was a ludicrous thought. It had to be an acoustic anomaly, the sound from another apartment being funneled through the shaft and amplified in this specific spot. It had to be. I pulled away from the wall, my skin prickling. As I stepped back, the crying stopped. Not faded away. It just stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed into the void was immense, heavier than any sound. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, listening to the frantic thumping of my own heart. The crying was bad. The sudden, responsive silence was so much worse. It felt like I was no longer just hearing something. It felt like something was listening back. The following days were a study in strained normalcy. I went to work. I reviewed blueprints. I spoke with contractors. But the entire time, a part of my mind remained in my apartment, pressed against that living room wall, listening. The crying had changed its pattern. It was no longer a nightly guarantee. It became unpredictable. Sometimes it would start in the middle of the afternoon, a faint, ghostly complaint beneath the noise of the city. Other times, the nights would be utterly silent, and I would lie awake in bed, tense and waiting, finding the absence of the sound almost as disturbing as its presence. My sleep suffered. I developed a nervous habit of tilting my head, listening for something that no one else could hear. My logical mind, my greatest defense, was beginning to fail me. I tried every explanation I could conjure. An elaborate prank. A malfunctioning baby monitor from another apartment somehow broadcasting on a frequency only my electronics, or the building's wiring could pick up. I even went so far as to unplug everything in my apartment one night. The television, the router, the lamps, even the refrigerator, and sat in the dark, waiting. The crying started on schedule, a thin, disembodied wail in the thick, silent darkness. It was not electronic. I had to know if I was the only one. My neighbor across the hall in 4A was a young family, but I had never seen them with an infant. Next, I considered Mrs. Gable in 3B. She was the building's unofficial historian, a tiny woman with sharp eyes who had lived there for over 50 years. If anyone knew about the building's quirks, it would be her. I caught her in the lobby one afternoon as she was collecting her mail. "Mrs. Gable," I began, trying to sound casual. "A bit of a strange question for you. The acoustics in this building are a bit odd, aren't they?" She looked up at me over the top of her spectacles, her gaze unnervingly direct. "Something's travel," she said, her voice dry as old paper. "Right," I said, encouraged. "It's just that, lately, I've been hearing a sound in my apartment for a baby. Crying. I was wondering if you knew if anyone in the building recently had a child." A shuddered look came over her face. The change was instantaneous and total. Her friendly, gossipy demeanor vanished, replaced by a stony impassivity. She turned back to her mailbox, fumbling with the small key. "I don't concern myself with the business of others, Mr. Harris. It's just that it's quite persistent," I pressed, a note of desperation creeping into my voice. "It sounds so close. Almost like it's in my living room." She slammed her mailbox shut with a sharp clang that echoed in the marble lobby. She turned to face me, her eyes dark. "Some things are better left unheard, Mr. Harris. You're a sensible man. An architect. You understand structures. You should understand that some walls are not meant to be listened to. Without another word, she walked stiffly toward the elevator, leaving me standing by the mailboxes, a cold dread seeping into my bones. Her reaction wasn't one of confusion, it was one of warning. She knew. She knew what I was hearing. That night, the crying returned with a new, terrifying quality. It was no longer just sad. It was demanding. It seemed to follow me. When I was in the kitchen, it sounded like it was coming from the living room. When I moved to the living room, it seemed to shift, now emanating from the small coat closet near the front door. I felt like a mouse being toyed with by an unseen cat. Finally, I stood perfectly still in the geographic center of my apartment, my breathing shallow. The sound consolidated, focusing itself with chilling precision. It was coming, loud and clear, from a specific spot on the living room wall. A section of the wall that looked perfectly normal, just plaster and paint, but was, according to the original building plans I had looked up out of morbid curiosity, the location of a sealed-up dumbwaiter shaft. The crying was not in the pipes or the vents. It was in there. And it sounded like it wanted to get out. Sleep had become a foreign country. My work, once a source of pride and precision, was now a landscape of blurred lines and forgotten details. My thoughts were consumed by a single, looping obsession, the weeping in the wall. Mrs. Gable's warning echoed in my mind, but it was too late for caution. The thing in my apartment had moved beyond a simple haunting. It felt personal now. It felt like a challenge. My architect's mind, the part of me that craved order and understanding, could not let this stand. An anomaly in a system must be identified and corrected. A sealed space must be unsealed. I made the decision on a Saturday. The sun was streaming through the windows, a mockery of the gloom that had settled deep inside me. I would not be driven from my home by a noise. I would confront it. I would find its source, expose it to the light, and through logic and force of will, I would make it stop. I went to the hardware store and bought a small sledgehammer, a pry bar, and a dust mask. The man at the counter gave me a cheerful look. "Big project?" he asked. I simply nodded, the lie feeling thick in my throat. Back in the apartment, I put on the mask and stood before the wall. The apartment was silent. Utterly, completely silent. Not even the usual groans from the building or the distant traffic. It was a heavy, expectant silence, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The sound was gone, but its absence was a presence in itself. It was taunting me. I took a deep breath, the filter of the mask tasting of plastic and chemicals. I hefted the sledgehammer. It felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. The first blow was tentative. It left a spiderweb of cracks in the old paint and plaster. The sound was jarring, an act of violence against the quiet. I struck again, harder this time. A chunk of plaster broke loose, falling to the floor and shattering into a cloud of white dust. Beneath it, I saw dark, wooden slats. The lath of the original construction. I switched to the pry bar, jamming it into the cracks and wrenching. Wood splintered. Plaster rained down. Sweat dripped into my eyes, and my arms burned with the effort. I worked with a frantic, feverish energy, driven by something I no longer understood. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a kind of rage. A rage at the unknown, at the thing that had stolen my peace and was slowly dismantling my sanity. After what felt like an hour, I had created a jagged hole large enough to peer into. The air that drifted out was stale and cold, carrying a faint, cloying scent of dust and something else. Something vaguely sweet and decayed. I shone a flashlight into the darkness. It was the dumbwaiter shaft, just as the blueprints had shown. A narrow, dark space, barely 2 feet square. At the bottom of the shaft, resting on the floor of my apartment level, was a small, dark shape. My heart hammered against my ribs. With trembling hands, I tore away more of the lath and plaster until the opening was large enough to reach into. I leaned in, the flashlight beam shaking. It wasn't just a shape. It was an object. It was a small wooden cradle, its dark wood covered in a thick layer of grime. It was empty. The paint was peeling, and one of the rockers was broken. It was a relic from another time, forgotten and sealed away. I stared at it, a wave of anticlimactic disappointment washing over me. It was just an old cradle. Then, as my light traced the interior of the dusty wooden box, the crying started again. It wasn't coming from above or below. It wasn't echoing down the shaft. It was coming from right in front of me. It was emanating directly from the empty cradle, a full-throated, desolate wail that was so loud, so clear, and so undeniably present that I scrambled backward, falling to the floor amidst the plaster dust and splinters of wood. The sound was not an echo. It was here. For a long time, I just sat on the floor, covered in white dust, staring at the ragged hole in my life. The crying from the cradle was incessant, a torrent of misery that filled the room. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut, but something else was rising to meet it, a grim, exhausted resolve. The mystery was partially solved. I had found the source, the focal point. Now I had to understand the cause. There was only one person who might give me the answers I needed. I didn't bother to clean myself up. I left the hammer on the floor, walked out of my apartment looking like a ghost, and went down one flight of stairs to 3B. I knocked on Mrs. Gable's door, my knuckles leaving white smudges on the dark wood. She opened it a crack, her chains still in place. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in my appearance, the dust-caked clothes, the wild look in my eyes. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "What have you done?" "I opened the wall," I said, my own voice flat and dead. "The old dumbwaiter shaft. There's a cradle inside. You knew, didn't you? You have to tell me." She stared at me for a long moment, her old face a mask of pity and fear. Then, with a sigh that seemed to deflate her entire body, she slid the chain free and opened the door. "Come in," she said. "You had better come in." Her apartment was the mirror image of mine, but filled with a lifetime of memories. Heavy floral furniture, doilies, framed photographs on every surface. She gestured for me to sit on a plastic-covered sofa, though I remained standing, not wanting to ruin her things. She sat in a worn armchair opposite me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I was a young woman when I moved into this building," she began, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. "The apartment you have, for B, was occupied by another young woman. Her name was Eleanor. She was quiet, kept to herself. This was a long time ago, you understand. Things were different. People didn't talk about their troubles." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Eleanor had a baby. There was no husband. She hid the pregnancy, and she tried to hide the baby. In a building like this, though, you can't hide a thing like a crying infant. People heard. They talked. They judged. She grew more and more withdrawn. The baby would cry and cry, and I would hear Eleanor through the floor, pacing back and forth, sometimes weeping herself. A chill traced its way down my spine. What happened to them?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "One day," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice trembling slightly, "the crying stopped. Just like that. After weeks of it, the silence was deafening. A few of us were worried. We knocked on her door, but she never answered. After a few days, the superintendent let himself in. The apartment was empty. Eleanor was gone. All of her things were gone. There was no sign of her, and no sign of the baby. She finally looked at me, her eyes wet with ancient tears. But she left one thing behind. They found it a year later, when new tenants complained of a smell. They found where she had sealed the dumbwaiter shaft. The superintendent who opened it up, he never spoke of what he saw. He just sealed it again, properly this time, with plaster. He told the landlord it was a dead animal. But the story got out. The story was that the poor girl, in her desperation, couldn't bear the crying anymore. So she made it stop. And she laid her child to rest in its cradle and sealed it away where no one would find it. The room felt cold, my breath catching in my chest. It's an echo, then? I asked. A memory? It's more than that, she whispered, leaning forward. It's a stain. A tragedy so deep it's soaked into the wood and the plaster. It waits. And it feeds on attention. The more you listen, the more you look for it, the stronger it gets. It's not just a sound anymore, Mr. Harris. It's a hunger. A need to have what it was denied. By opening that wall, you've given it a doorway. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an email from my firm. Subject: termination of employment. My absences, my missed deadlines, my distracted behavior. I had lost my job. The weeping had cost me everything. I looked from the phone to Mrs. Gable's terrified face, and I knew my ordeal was far from over. I had invited it in, and now it was hungry. Returning to my apartment was like stepping into a tomb. The hole in the wall gaped like a wound, and from it, the sound of the crying baby poured out, no longer faint or ethereal, but raw and agonizingly real. It filled every corner of the space, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I had lost my job, my peace, my grip on reality. I was a man adrift, and this apartment, this place of torment, was my only island. Fleeing felt impossible. Where would I go? The sound was in my head now, a permanent resident. I felt a strange, horrifying bond with the tragedy that had unfolded here. I was part of its story now. The haunting escalated with a terrifying speed. It was no longer just the sound. The air in the apartment grew frigid, a damp cold that clung to my skin and sunk into my bones, regardless of the radiator's hiss. Objects began to move. A book sliding off a shelf. A glass of water tipping over on the kitchen counter when I was nowhere near it. They were small things, petty acts of a poltergeist, but they were eroding the last of my resolve. The true horror remained centered on the cradle. I started to see it. At first, it was just a shimmer in the air above the small wooden box, a distortion in the light like heat rising from pavement. Then, it began to take shape. In my peripheral vision, I would catch a glimpse of a tiny, swaddled form lying in the cradle. When I would turn to look directly, there would be nothing but dust and shadow. But the indentation on the thin, rotted blanket inside seemed deeper now, more defined, as if a weight had just recently been lifted. The crying was constant, a backdrop to every waking moment, a piercing soundtrack to my descent into madness. One night, I could take no more. Sleep deprived and hollowed out, I stood before the opening in the wall, staring at the cradle. The crying was frantic, desperate. I understood what Mrs. Gable had meant. It was a hunger, a need. It wasn't the malicious spirit of a demon. It was the focused, all-consuming need of an infant who had died alone in the dark, wanting the one thing it had never known in its short, tragic life: comfort. It didn't want to be exorcised. It didn't want to be banished. It wanted to be held. The thought was utterly insane. It was a product of a mind that had been broken by isolation and fear. But in that moment, It felt like the only truth left in the world. I was its caretaker now, the unwilling inheritor of an ancient sorrow. My own life was in ruins. What more did I have to lose? With a strange sense of calm, a resignation that felt like floating, I knelt before the hole in the wall. I reached my hands out, my arms trembling, and extended them over the cradle. "It's all right," I whispered, the words feeling alien in my own mouth. "I'm here. It's all right." I closed my eyes and lowered my arms into the cradle, into the shimmering space where I sometimes saw the shape. I expected to feel nothing but dusty wood. Instead, my hands met a profound, impossible cold. It was not the cold of the room, but a deep, cellular cold, a cold that felt like an absence of all life and warmth. And then I felt it. A weight. A small but distinct weight settled into my arms. It was no heavier than a bag of sugar, but its presence was immense. And the crying stopped. The silence was absolute. It was a physical thing, a pressure that pushed against my eardrums, more deafening than any sound had ever been. I opened my eyes. There was nothing in my arms. The air was clear. The cradle was empty. But the feeling of that small, cold weight lingered, a phantom sensation against my skin. I slowly, carefully, drew my arms back, as if I were holding something precious. I stood up and walked to my armchair. I sat down. I began to rock, my arms moving in a gentle, rhythmic motion, cradling the invisible burden. I don't hear the crying anymore. The apartment is quiet. The cold has receded. The objects stay in their places. But I cannot leave. I sit in my chair for hours every day. I feel the weight in my arms. I have a duty now. I am the sole occupant of apartment 4B, the man who lives alone. I am its keeper. I pacified the weeping in the walls, but in doing so, I have become trapped in the silence. And I know, with a certainty that chills me more than any cry ever could, that I will be rocking this empty space for the rest of my life.